Thank you to the organisers for the opportunity to speak. I should say at the outset that I'm primarily a specialist in the Balkans and Eastern Europe, which I've been thinking and writing about for some years, in particular on the question of border changes and the forces which govern these. But in the course of studying the region, I've been led to investigate the question of borders and border changes more broadly, leading me to various conclusions, 10 of which I will set out now. And what they add up to, as the title of this presentation suggests, is my belief that the world is moving into a new age of territorial revisionism, in which annexations, secessions, and the integration and disintegration of states are likely to become features of the international system. So number one, my first conclusion is that changes to international borders are never something that just happens, but a consequence of geopolitical competition, a weapon in the hands of great powers, which ultimately get to decide where borders lie. Broadly, each of the great powers wants to organise the map of the world in a way that upholds and advances its strategic interests, ideally at the expense of its opponents, and the most powerful actor in the international system gets to align borders most closely with its particular interests. And moreover, the use of border adjustments as a geopolitical weapon increases as competition among the great powers intensifies, leading to a clear pattern over time in which borders change whenever the great powers clash. My second conclusion is that in pursuing these geopolitical interests, the great powers are invariably pursuing one or more of three distinct goals. The most important is security, for which the configuration of international borders is a critical determinant. At home, great powers seek both to expand their own frontiers and to establish buffers on their borders, involving independence from friendly nations and the denial of independence to unfriendly ones, which must remain stateless minorities. Abroad, the great powers have an interest in shrinking their rivals and encircling them with local opponents, denying their rivals a sphere of influence, again involving independence from friendly nations and the denial of independence to unfriendly ones. Another goal is economics and specifically prosperity, which at times has meant asserting direct ownership over a valuable economic asset such as a natural resource, port, or a supply line by incorporating it into the borders of the state itself. Alternatively, the great powers can arrange borders to ensure economic assets are owned by favoured groups and denied to hostile groups which might make their asset available to their great power rivals. And as a general rule, the great powers do not want conflicts over borders to interrupt crucial supply lines and usually act to close down such disputes. And the third goal is the promotion of moral values, subjectively defined and constantly shifting. A century ago, the great powers' approach to questions of borders was guided by a belief in national sovereignty. But more recently, this has been turned on its head, and the West's approach to borders has been shaped by opposition to nationalism and an emphasis on human rights. And by way of example, the United States and its allies justified the independence of Kosovo as a means to end the suffering of a minority group at the hands of a supposedly oppressive majority. And for similar reasons, in the European Union, integrationists have justified the steady dissolving of national borders between member states, not just as a practical, but also as a moral endeavour. My third conclusion is that downstream from the great powers' interest in security, economics, and morality come norms that both justify the particular configuration of borders which the dominant powers have forged, and at least in theory set the rules for the recognition of new states. In the 19th early 20th centuries, the great powers established norms around sovereignty, political independence, and the self-determination of nations. But these were supplanted in the post-war period by the norm of territorial integrity. Formerly European colonies were recognised, but only within their existing administrative boundaries, denying ethnic tribal groups such as the Igbo of Biafra the right to independence from Nigeria. And more recently, the United States has pushed the right of remedial secession as a new international law, which challenges the earlier law of territorial integrity and was used as justification for the United States separation of Kosovo from Serbia. My fourth conclusion is that while border changes are governed primarily by rivalries between the great powers, smaller nations which are trying to establish their independence are also a driving factor. Minority groups from the Basques, Catalans to the Bosnian Serbs, Abkhazians and Ossetians are continually pressurizing the great powers to support their cause, and they exploit every opportunity, including conflict between the great powers, to try and advance their national goals. And this is relevant because while they can't change borders by themselves, they can provide, their grievances can provide the means by which the leading powers can truncate or break up their rivals, much as the Allies backed the various national groups seeking independence from the Austro-Hungarian and Russian empires. And conversely, majority groups which want to preserve existing borders, from the Spanish to the Bosniaks, continually lobby the great powers to deny local separatists their independence. My fifth conclusion is that changes in borders are rarely isolated incidents, even if it may seem like it at the time, but rather that most changes in borders come in groups, in clusters, affecting multiple states, and invariably against the backdrop of a clash between great powers. And seemingly isolated cases are usually the first in a cycle of border adjustments to come, reflecting underlying shifts in the international balance of power and intensifying great power competition. Hence, we can look back, for example, at Prussia's seizure of Holstein in 1867, the emergence of proto-states in the Balkans in the late 19th century, and Japan's territorial seizures in East Asia in the early 20th century, initially as isolated events, but these were, in fact, harbingers of a more comprehensive set of border changes, which eventually manifested themselves in the two world wars and the emergence of multiple new states in Europe and Asia. My sixth conclusion is that processes of territorial revisionism often involve unintended consequences as revisionist powers, which seek to expand their borders, often unleash forces which they cannot control, causing that power to contract or even collapse at the hands of its opponents. For example, Austria attempted to annex Bosnia and Herzegovina in 1914, only for this to lead to the collapse of the empire 4 years later. Germany tried twice to expand its borders in the 20th century, only to be truncated and partitioned by its enemies at the end of World War II. And the Soviet Union collapsed after trying to expand its influence into Afghanistan in the 1980s. So that's the theoretical part of my presentation. And my seventh conclusion is that a new cycle of border changes is now underway, triggered by Russia, a troubled and declining state which fears for its own security and wants to establish new strategic buffers to protect the country against encroachment by NATO and the West. It initially demonstrated its willingness to revise the current territorial settlement in 2008 in Georgia, which lost the provinces of South Ossetia and Abkhazia after Russia's invasion. But the real harbinger of things to come has been Russia's invasion and subsequent partition of Ukraine, with the aim, if not initially, then eventually, of establishing the Russian-speaking and therefore more compliant part of the country as a new strategic buffer. And consequently, and this is my eighth conclusion, other great powers are now pursuing border changes in their own interests, for which the evidence is becoming ever clearer. China is now openly seeking to revise the current territorial settlement in East Asia, above all by integrating Taiwan, motivated by a desire for security from the United States and the acquisition of valuable economic assets, all supported by a resurgent Chinese nationalism which aims at national unification, and which, ironically, has been justified by the reinterpretation of the norm of territorial integrity aimed not at protecting existing borders, but restoring China's earlier integrity following its disintegration in the 19th and early 20th centuries. A resurgent Turkey is now pursuing a revisionist agenda in its neighbourhood, with the aim of acquiring economic assets and enhancing its security in a region where it dwarfs its closest neighbours. And to this end, Ankara has staked a claim to an exclusive economic zone in a corridor of sea connecting the country to Libya, and is steadily trying to integrate northern Cyprus into the rest of Turkey. The United States, under Donald Trump, is now threatening to annex Greenland, to absorb Canada, and to occupy the Panama Canal to ensure that these valuable economic assets are put to the disposal of the United States and not to rivals such as China. And special mention should also be made of the European Union, an aspiring great power which is pursuing the goal of enlargement into Eastern Europe with the aim of rolling back the influence of rival powers in the remaining unintegrated parts of the region. And that this has been combined with persistent efforts by integrationists in countries in Western Europe to downgrade the independence of the EU's member states in what amounts to the absorption by a aspiring European superstate of one-time independent states whose borders cease to be international. My ninth conclusion is that amidst growing conflict between the great powers, various smaller nations have spotted an opportunity to try and establish their statehood. These include the Palestinians, who want to forge an independent state on the territory, including Israel, calculating that Turkey, Russia and Iran will back them, and Azerbaijan, backed by Turkey, which has expanded its border after conquering and expelling much of its Armenian population from the disputed enclave of Nagorno-Karabakh. And in the Balkans, Bosnian Serbs are pushing their goal of establishing a unified nation state with Serbia, with the help of Russia, while Serbia is seeking to annex the Serb-populated north of Kosovo. And elsewhere in Europe, numerous other national groups from Ireland to Belgium and Spain are also seeking to change borders in what they see as increasingly advantageous geopolitical circumstances. So finally, my 10th conclusion is that two of these great powers are at risk of unintended consequences, with the potential for a more radical shake-up of borders still. Russia, in particular, is vulnerable as its campaign to control Ukraine takes its toll on the state, galvanizing what I see as a long-term process of decline. In the last couple of years, peoples in the spate of Russian republics, from Kaliningrad to Tatarstan, Smolensk, and the rebellious northern Caucasus, where Turkey is active, have called for independence from Moscow. And so too is the European Union vulnerable as it seeks to both deepen and widen in the absence of strong internal legitimacy and an increasingly hostile relationship with Russia, China, and now also the United States. And under conditions of more intense geopolitical competition, I would not bet on the survival of the European Union, nor the survival of some of its member states, at least in their existing form. And if this happens, I think the winners would be the United States and China, which would divide up Russia and Europe between them, with Northern and Eastern Europe moving into the American orbit, and China consolidating its influence in Central and Western Europe. And downstream from all this, ideas of territorial integrity which prevail today would inevitably be abandoned in favour of new laws which imbued such an outcome with a moral and legal veneer to justify Chinese and American actions. So these are my 10 conclusions which bring my presentation to an end. And in doing so, I don't pretend to know exactly what the future will bring, at least in the specifics. But the one thing of which I'm sure is that the global map in the years and decades to come is certain to be different to the one that now exists. If a map is a snapshot of the balance of international power and the interests and the beliefs of great powers at any one moment in time, then today's map, which reflects a world shaped by the United States and its allies, will not be